Welcome to day 164. We'll be looking at 1 Kings chapters 13 to 14, 2 Chronicles 12, and Philippians 3 today. Jeroboam is worshiping at one of his altars, and a holy man comes from Judah to announce that a new son will be born to Rehoboam's family, and the false altars of Israel will be broken. Jeroboam tries to grab the guy, but his arm doesn't work, and then his altar breaks as foretold. Jeroboam asks for healing, and the guy prays and heals this king and then goes back home to Judah in obedience to God. A prophet who had stayed in Israel then went after the holy man and lured him back to Israel for a meal with the prophet's family. God spoke through the prophet and pointed out the disobedience of the holy man, who then was killed by a lion as he tried to return to Judah. The prophet collected the body and buried it honorably, and then gave God's message against the new evil religion Jeroboam was establishing in Israel, and asked his sons to bury himself by the holy man of Judah when he himself died. Jeroboam continued to build up a false religion to a false god, which would be his downfall. Then his son gets sick, and he sends his wife to Abijah, the prophet, who told Jeroboam that he would be king of Israel. She gets to the prophet, but the prophet knows who she is and brings God's message to her, reminding her that Jeroboam is not a faithful servant like Daniel, worshiping the true God. God is angry and will bring doom on the household of Jeroboam. Go home and your son will die and be buried, and God will lift up a new king to replace Jeroboam. A big part of God's anger with the kings who drift away is that they either create new religions and gods, or they turn to the religious practices of area gods that include sexual activity as part of worship, and sometimes human sacrifice. God created intimate love as a sign of God's love for us and wants us to have healthy, intimate relationships within monogamous, committed relationships, not group events in public. This seems like a message from far away from us today. We are struggling with people who don't seem to feel a need for spirituality of any kind in their lives, or maybe a vague spirituality that leads to people feeling better about themselves. But what is faithfulness and obedience to God? Isn't God's message throughout the Bible about caring for community so that all people have enough? Isn't God's message about building community and not focusing just on our personal selves or our personal families and getting ahead of others? Another point, we see a reference here to another text, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. There are several references to other writings that explain this period of history, and we don't have all of these writings today. Maybe someday we will find a hidden cache like the Dead Sea Scrolls and get access to more of this history, but for now, we settle for the texts we currently have. Leaving Jeroboam, we return to Rehoboam in Judah. The king and people in this area are also falling away from the religious practices of God, and they were also bringing sexual activities into their worship spaces. The king of Egypt came and stole many resources, and Rehoboam replaced them with lesser valued goods. The people do respond positively to a prophet's warning, so Judah is not destroyed completely, but becomes servants of Egypt. We end with both of these kings dying. Turning now to Philippians, Paul continues to encourage people to be glad in God. Maybe this would have been helpful instruction for the people of Judah and Israel in our first readings today. Paul reminds us that our relationship with God isn't about the outward practices of circumcision and other worship, but about the worship of our hearts and our commitment to do God's work with our lives. Through the power of the Holy Spirit, we have the passion and inspiration and strength to work for God. Even Paul, with all his education and credentials, needed the support of the Spirit to do God's work. Jesus is what is important in our lives, not education and credentials and reputation. We need to keep focused on Jesus, focused on the work God puts before us. Let's not get distracted by people going in other directions around us, especially if it's an easier way than the sacrifice of Jesus. Turn towards the promise of Jesus and the beauty of God's kingdom. So basically, don't despair at the state of the world. Jesus has sent the Spirit to do God's work with new power. Together we will accomplish what none of us can do alone. Be inspired today, and we'll see you next time.